Welcome to part 2. This is the death and resurrection of philosophy toward Physiosophia, a biological priesthood of metaphysical physiology. Sounds complicated, right? But it is. But it isn't. So, the first things I want to talk about is that I am aware that there is such a thing as physiosophy already, and it's pretty obscure, but it has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today. It's not related. There might be some correlation in the things I talk about, but it's absolutely not related to this Kant series at all. And I've taken a break. I've been on a bit of a hiatus for the last 2 weeks, and I'm just going through a really, really insane situation right now with you can live with someone for years, and one day someone messages you, or you meet somebody that knows this person or knew that person in the past, and your entire world is fractured. You learn things about this person. I mean, and be careful with that, of course. Like, you got to make sure you have evidence. But with seeing evidence, I don't know if there's anything worse in this life. Like there's 3 major things that have happened to me that were absolutely crippling. One was the death of my father. When my father died, it was all of a sudden, and it was very traumatizing. I was not prepared. I was not ready. It changed me. It changed the trajectory of my life. It changed everything. Now, the second was when my girlfriend of, I guess, 8-9 years, she decided to pack up my kids one day and leave, to drive them across, 8,000 kilometers across Canada, and to what she would say, live closer to her family. That changed me as well. That was a, but the thing is, those 2 things, they changed me for the better. Like, after my father died, I actually, I lost the insecurity to like front my own band, to take on my own music project. And that actually led to me like touring all over the world, and it led to a whole entire an entirely new life of adventure and something extraordinary. When my girlfriend left me with my 2 sons, it devastated me, but it also gave me another set of strength and loss of fear to I actually started a relationship in a different country, and I actually went to that country and, lived there. And I mean, as a result of that, I'm still here now. I'm in Taiwan, and it's actually typhoon. There's a massive typhoon headed here right now, Typhoon Bavi. But now I've hit a third part. Now the third part is that I'm married. I've lived with my wife. I lived with my wife for a few years. She wanted to move back with her parents and, sort things out and, save money. And for me to live closer to work and get a small apartment to save money to move back to Canada and buy a house, and, for me to be job hunting, that kind of stuff. But in that term, there was someone that reached out to me about wanting me to know who my wife is. And I mean, I can't see anything positive coming of. I mean, it's absolutely life destroying. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, like I lived with somebody that was lying to me the entire time. I mean, it's completely insane. So anyways, I've taken a little bit of a break for the last 2 weeks, but I'm back and everything is a process. And, who knows, maybe what'll happen is with this, this third absolute devastating meteor that crashed into Earth here on me. Maybe I don't know what could I possibly do. I kind of did everything I wanted to do. I had a dream as a kid to be a musician and to be playing big festivals all over the world and be on TV shows and all. And I accomplished that. And I created music business conferences. I got to go over the world to do lectures about tourism and industry and PR and marketing in the music industry. I handled like 19 global trade missions for Canada with Canadian Music Week. Now I'm a humble teacher. I teach little children, and it's a grueling job. I mean, it's not like working in the oil field, like throwing around valves and pipe all day in like -40, but it's it takes a lot of my time. I mean, I got long days, and dealing with children and like teaching them and getting them up to speed and making sure they're paying attention. And I mean, I love them. I love to see them. I mean, after this devastating aspect of what happened with my wife recently, it's actually, I feel like now when I go into class, I'm with my family there, which is a very, very peculiar way to look at your work, to be honest. But yeah, I guess it's kind of my solace, but at the same time, I think the thing is I just need to reground myself. This podcast that I started, the essays I was writing, I mean, I kind of really dove heavily into philosophy because the relationship with my wife wasn't always so great. And there was a lot of empty space between us, even when we lived together. And so I did a lot of reading and I started writing a lot of these essays that I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I think it was kind of like a therapy. And then I finally decided, after she wanted to move back to her parents and I moved into my own small apartment here, I decided to start, okay, I'm going to be productive and start creating a podcast out of these things. And I think I'm just going to follow this trajectory for now. I'm going to keep editing my essays that I wrote. I'm going to keep, creating this podcast, these lecture series on these incredible thinkers. And, I'm also going to I'm going to try to start getting back into my relationship with God, my relationship with Jesus Christ. And part of this, honestly, this series here that I did on Kant, this is where all of this leads, just to give you like a spoiler alert. Right now we're going to go into the biological aspect of the similarities, these peculiar similarities between Kant and, the biology of the brain and, how our minds work. And I just want to make this clear. I had to rewrite this essay like 6 times the last 2 weeks here, because the thing is, Kant always said, once you take this transcendental philosophy and you put it in biology or you put it in psychology, it is no longer transcendental. This has a lot to do with how much Kant had to instate about faith, why he made room for faith. That even though he's telling us there's no way that we can know if there's a God or not, there's no way that we can know anything out of space and time, he said we had to make room for faith. This is exactly what he's talking about. And as crazy as this may sound, this is why I also think that Kant was some sort of prophet or some sort of angel. I don't know. the knowledge that he had in the late 18th century, because it's around, the 1770s. I mean, the knowledge that he's presenting is, I don't know how anybody could even think of these things back beyond that. Oh, and that's one thing I want to actually touch on. So, hey, this is my introduction to the part 2 lecture series of Kant, and I'm telling you about some personal stuff, and I'm kind of intermingling that with the Kant stuff here, and I'm going to touch on another aspect, and that's about our education systems, especially in the West. I can't speak towards places that I don't know about, but what I can tell you, like if you live in Canada, the education system for Western Canadians, like in Alberta, versus the education system for Newfoundlanders in the East is very different. The education system in Newfoundland, they raise laborers. They raise people to go get their, pipe fitting tickets, or carpenters or welders. They raise people intentionally through the education that they give them to go towards that pathway. That becomes very available for them. Whereas in like the West, I mean, the education system is much more rigorous. So it's like they're raising more. If you can succeed in the education system, I'm not saying everybody. I'm just saying that people that are, succeeding, is that they're raising more like tech people, scientists, this more of like white collar, I guess you would call it, where Newfoundland's education system is literally based on raising blue collar workers. Now, why is that significant? Because I also want to talk about the fact that like the ancient Greeks, I mean, I've already done about 6 or 7 episodes on Plato. You can check those out. Eventually I'm going to get to Aristotle. There's, I mean, the thinkers throughout history. I mean, okay, let's just look at Plato 2,500 years ago up to Kant, right? Like, let's just look at Plato to Kant. The amount of information, the amount of knowledge that people had, what is this life? How does the mind work? Like, what is the meaning? What are the possibilities of meaning? How could all of this work? You're not going to learn any of this stuff in our education system. No teacher is going to sit and talk to you about like the capacity of your mind, or about, how there's boundaries of space and time, or, I mean, even if you want to get out of the metaphysical and transcendental things, or like Plato, like the allegories. I mean, imagine teaching children about allegories and like the significance of metaphors and how deep life can be. Never mind all of that. Like we're not even taught how to do our taxes properly. It's is it a conspiracy? Is it a conspiracy against mankind? All right, well, you are not lost. You are here. And here's a preliminary note, okay, before we start part 2 here. This is my disclaimer. This lecture explores the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience through speculative frameworks. It is intended for conceptual exploration, and it does not constitute, medical, scientific, or professional advice at all. I am an independent researcher, and the arguments presented are for scholarly discussion and theoretical debate, and not empirical validation. Though the science papers that I'm going to cite in here or talk about, you can definitely check them out online, and they are peer-reviewed, and this is going to be amazing. There's like life hacks, to even find out your carbohydrate protein ratio for things. Like if you take a saltine cracker, you put it in your mouth, you chew it. If it hits about, like 30 seconds, well, then you should be having kind of a low carb diet. If it hits in like 3 seconds where the salt turns into sweet, then you're fine. I mean, you can eat as much carbohydrates as you want. You can live off of them. But if you chew that saltine cracker and it never turns sweet, or it takes like a minute or 2 minutes, it's like you should be eliminating all carbohydrates from your diet. And why aren't we taught things like this? Like, why aren't we growing up teaching our children about proper nutrition, about fats and proteins? And why is everything such a mystery and it's all being unveiled now in like 2026? Like, I mean, what was the purpose? They wanted to just raise enormous amounts of human beings in order to serve, so like we have to go to work in order to make money to buy the things we need, which creates the whole entire economic market in the first place. And then we're the ones that work, supplying it. We're the purchasers. Like not only are we the laborers, but we're also the purchasers. I mean, when I was growing up, I found it incredibly weird that, like, why do I have to pay for food? If I don't have food, like, I'm going to die. Why do I have to pay for food? Like, why does anybody have to pay for shelter? If I don't have shelter, I'll die. And that's kind of, I guess that's where we're at. It's like, if you don't participate in this system, you die, All right. Now to the lecture at hand. I am neither a physicist nor biologist nor professor. As I am merely reporting on things. Much of my adult life was spent as a wanderer, a seeker. After the death of my parents, I became a world traveler, via touring musician. Today, as I told you, I'm a teacher, I'm an avid reader, and a relentless seeker of wisdom and knowledge. I'm older now. I can see the clock winding down. I know deep inside, deep down inside, I don't have much time left, but I do remain deeply thankful to all the great minds of our collected humanity. I'm grateful for their greatness, for the meaning and depth they have given my life. For me, philosophy became the cure to boredom. Where philosophy was, boredom was not. Where philosophy was, pain was not. Over the years, I've learned that any idea worthy of our sustained attention must first captivate us. It must feel compelling, urgent, alive. So before we step into the body of this work, allow me a few candid words about why I have written this and how I hope it will be received. So as you may or may not know, the word philosophy actually comes from the ancient Greek word philosophia, a love for wisdom. Philo being the love and Sophia being wisdom. It's a passion for understanding our place both within ourselves and in the vast world beyond. Plato turned that love inward toward the nature of the human soul and the just society. Aristotle directed it outward, cataloging the living world and laying the groundwork for what would later become the natural sciences. Pythagoras, even before these guys, was a mathematician and mystic, revealing the hidden geometric harmonies of number and form. From all these early inquiries branched mathematics, physics, biology, and now in our own time, the first tangible methodological borrowings from particle physics into neuroscience, pointing toward an extraordinary conceptual fusion yet to come. What we explore in this lecture stands light years from these humble origins, yet remains intimately connected to all of those great minds of the past. What really took my breath away when I first encountered these discoveries that I'm going to talk about today was how precisely the mathematical tools of latest physics, they forged to tame the infinities of the quantum vacuum, are now mapping the lattice of the mind itself. So lattice, just in case you don't know, that's the LATTICE. this is like basically setting grids onto space, right? So like in space, because there's so many stars and it's just so massive, what they did is tried to they tried to basically measure or quantify findings by, and even on a microscopic, I mean beyond microscopic, on a atomic level, they use this kind of lattice model, and the lattice model is it's a grid. So you put things in a grid in order to understand measurement, understand movement, inside of a grid instead of it being inside of infinity, and that way we can understand things, in our own sort of way. And now they've done this with the brain as well. Okay, so just I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible because again, I'm not a scientist. I didn't do these experiments. It's just things that I read about, and I'm going to try to relay them to you here. So section 1 is we're going to talk about the lattice work and the optimization bridge. So let us begin our inquiry with a thought experiment, one that strips away the familiar luminous comforts of our daily existence. And imagine that you are suddenly thrust into a pitch black, entirely unfamiliar subterranean cavern. The air is cold, the silence is absolute, and your eyes strain against an impenetrable heavy darkness. As you cautiously extend your foot, your boot meets a solid plane. You take a step, then another. Your hand brushes against a jagged wall, and you instinctively turn your body to trace its length. Feeling the rough texture of the stone, within moments and without a single photon of light entering your retinas to provide context, your mind begins to construct a map. You are building an architecture of the unseen. You do not merely passively receive the tactile sensations of cold stone against your fingertips. You actively place those sensations in a coherent spatial coordinate system. You know what is behind you and what is in front of you and what is beside you now. But from where precisely does this coordinate system originate? Did the pitch black cavern hand you the geometry? Did the void somehow whisper its dimensions into your ear? Or did you bring the entire framework of space into the darkness with you? This seemingly simple question resets, it rests at the very bedrock of human cognition. It is a puzzle that has tormented the greatest minds in the history of philosophy. For centuries, the prevailing assumption, championed by the steadfast empiricists like John Locke and David Hume, was that we learn about space strictly by moving through it. Locke famously argued that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Hume took this further, suggesting that all our complex ideas are merely faint copies of our sensory impressions. In their view, the physical environment writes its rules upon the passive minds. Geometry, therefore, is merely a habit of observation, a collection of associated memories derived from bumping into things over and over again. Yet this empiricist explanation always harbored a fatal, unavoidable weakness. It could never account for the apodeictic certainty, the absolute, unbending mathematical necessity of spatial relations. If space were merely a habit of learned from experience, our geometric truths would only be probabilities. We would be forced to say things like, triangles usually have 180 degrees based on what we have observed in our limited sample size. But we don't say those things. We know with unbreakable universal certainty the laws of geometry prior to measuring any specific object in the world, as the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid observed in his brilliant critiques of Hume. If the mind were truly a blank slate, we would be utterly incapable of organizing the chaotic, blooming, buzzing flood of sensory data into anything recognizable. There must be a pre-existing architecture. We must possess the mold before we pour the plaster. How is it then that we can navigate not just the physical dirt of the earth, but the crystalline conceptual world of pure geometry? In the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant shattered the empiricist illusion with what he proudly termed his Copernican revolution. As we spoke about in part one, Kant warned us in his monumental Critique of Pure Reason, if we stubbornly assume that our minds must passively conform to the objects of the world, we will never secure any universal truths. Our knowledge would be forever contingent, forever subject to the whims of the next observation. Instead, Kant proposed a radical, breathtaking inversion. We must recognize that the objects of the world, in order to be experienced by us at all, they must conform to the necessary innate structures of our cognition. When we gaze up at the starry heavens, taking in the vast distances and the orbital dance of the celestial bodies, we are not looking at, quote unquote, space as a thing in itself, floating out there in the void independent of our minds. For Kant, space is not an empirical concept derived from outer experience. Rather, space is the pure form of outer intuition. It is a necessary a priori representation that underlies and makes possible all outer perceptions. You cannot even conceive of a world without space. Though you can effortlessly imagine a space completely devoid of objects, space is the pre-formatted canvas upon which the universe is painted. Plato, long before the Enlightenment, sensed that our grasp of perfect geometric forms could not possibly be derived from the messy, decaying shadows of physical reality. As Plato illustrated through his famous allegory of the cave, he believed we must be remembering these perfect forms from a higher, eternal realm of ideals. But Kant brought the heavens down to earth. He grounded this mathematical certainty not in some mystical, inaccessible realm of ethereal forms, but in the structural operational architecture of the human mind itself. Space is the cognitive lens through which we are condemned and uniquely privileged. All of this to view reality. We generate the dimensions. For over 2 centuries, Kant's proposition was treated by many as a beautiful, albeit untestable, philosophical abstraction. Later generations of scientists, behaviorists, and cynical philosophers ridiculed the idea of innate forms. They confidently assured us that advancing neuroscience would eventually prove Kant wrong. They promised that the brain would be revealed as nothing more than a wet, chaotic sponge, a passive receiver molded entirely by the environmental stimuli, operant conditioning and social forces. But they were profoundly wrong. As we cross the threshold into the 21st century, we are witnessing the definitive death of that reductionist empiricism and a renaissance of Kantian philosophy. This resurgence is not taking place in the dusty, quiet armchairs of traditional metaphysics. It is unfolding under the harsh, exacting lights of the modern biological laboratory. We are entering the era of Physiosophy, a biological priesthood of metaphysical physiology, where abstract philosophical deduction finds an outstanding structural homology in empirical findings. We must recognize, however, that these biological findings represent the phenomenal hardware that executes the transcendental software. The physical brain remains the substrate, not the transcendental cause. Crucially, we must maintain a vital distinction. Sorry, this is a Kant quote. Quote, crucially, we must maintain a vital distinction. The physical brain is itself physical matter, and therefore an appearance, a phenomenon that already presupposes space and time to exist. Biology, as a set of observable physical processes, cannot generate the transcendental conditions that make biology observable in the first place, end quote. To witness this phenomenal correlation firsthand, we must journey into the physical architecture of the brain, specifically to a small region located beside the hippocampus known as the medial entorhinal cortex. In 2005, neuroscientists May Britt and Edvard Moser conducted an experiment that provides a striking biological illustration of spatial organization, an achievement that earned the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. The Mosers placed microelectrodes in the entorhinal cortex of rats, allowing the animals to forage freely for chocolate crumbs in an open, observable enclosure. The researchers meticulously monitored the electrical spiking of individual neurons as the rats navigated the space. What they discovered was so mathematically precise, so geometrically perfect, that it initially defied all conventional biological belief. They found what are now globally known as grid cells. As a rat moved across the floor, a single grid cell would fire, but it did not fire just once in a specific corner, nor did it fire randomly across the room. It fired at multiple, highly specific locations across the enclosure. When the researchers plotted these firing locations on a digital map of the floor, the dots connected to form a perfectly regular, unbending hexagonal lattice. The entire physical environment was tiled in a staggering geometric pattern, functionally identical to the molecular structure of graphene or the hexagonal packaging of a honeycomb. Crucially, this hexagonal grid appears to function independently of environmental learning. If a rat is placed into a completely novel room, even in total darkness, the hexagonal grid emerges instantaneously. The rat does not wait for the room to dictate its dimensions. Rather, its internal physiological state immediately reflects a pre-existing geometric metric. Within a Kantian framework, the grid cell network can be understood as a phenomenal correlate of the mind's innate a priori capacity for spatial organization, revealing a striking resonance between neural architecture and the transcendental structures that Kant derived by pure reason. So what this means is that the lattice is already there. You know, it's humming in the dark of the skull, right inside the brain before the first step is ever taken. It is the absolute a priori condition for the experience of space. The brain represents this coordinate system internally, reflecting the way we project it onto the sensory manifold so that coherent experience becomes possible. The rat brings the map to the maze, just exactly how Kant argued that the mind actively structures reality. The hexagonal grid serves as the physiological counterpart to the loom upon which the fabric of our outer intuition is woven. Without these innate subjective a priori forms, the sensory data of the world would be, in Kant's word, blind, a chaotic, unnavigable storm of noise. But we must push our philosophical inquiry even further. We must ask, why a hexagon? Why not a Cartesian square grid, like the graph paper we used in primary school mathematics? Why not a series of concentric circles or a random scattering of nodal points? In 2024, mathematicians and computational neuroscientists finalized rigorous, undeniable proofs demonstrating that this hexagonal spatial periodicity is by no means an accident of blind meandering evolution. It is not a biological quirk. It is, in fact, the uniquely parsimonious, mathematically optimal solution for encoding two-dimensional trajectories. When any system, whether it is a biological organism striving to survive or an artificial intelligence mapping a terrain, they both need to encode the maximum amount of spatial information with the highest possible resolution, while simultaneously expending the lowest possible energetic cost. Mathematics dictates that the hexagonal lattice is the ultimate limit of efficiency. It provides the tightest possible packing of firing fields on a two-dimensional plane. In a hexagonal grid, the distance from any one firing node to all of its immediate neighbors is perfectly symmetrical and equidistant. No matter which direction the organism moves, the metric remains flawlessly consistent. It is the absolute pinnacle of geometric economy. This mathematical optimality is breathtaking. It reveals that the brain is not merely a haphazard kludge of evolutionary compromises cobbled together by random genetic mutations. Instead, it is a system that has converged upon universal mathematical truth. The structures of our cognition are bound by logical and geometric necessity. As Galileo Galilei once beautifully observed, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. But now, gazing deep into the entorhinal cortex, we see that the book of the mind itself is written in that exact same immutable language. Kant insisted that our a priori intuitions must possess strict universality and necessity, traits that can never ever be derived from mere empirical habit. While the hexagonal lattice reflects this mathematical necessity, we must emphasize that space and time are subjective a priori forms of intuition. Their validity as transcendental grounds would be destroyed if they were derived from any empirical observation of neural geometry. The entorhinal architecture is not the cause of space, but rather the phenomenal correlate of a mind intimately calibrated to the deepest mathematical truths of reality. To truly grasp the scale and profundity of this internal architecture, we must boldly extend our gaze away from biology toward the fundamental physics of the universe itself, and then forge a bridge between those two parties. Let us begin with a parable. Okay, so imagine a map maker, a cartographer who spent his life mapping the meandering rivers of his homeland. One day he looks up at the night sky and he notices the orbital paths of the distant planets, and as drawn in his astronomical charts, trace curves perfectly identical to the river bends on his own maps. He is struck by a profound sense of cosmic unity. He might declare in a moment of breathless enthusiasm that the rivers are intimately connected to the planets, that the water flows according to the same celestial laws, or that the heavens are somehow pulling the streams. But a more rigorous observer would gently correct him. The river and the planet are governed by entirely different physical forces, one by gravity and orbital mechanics, and the other by hydrology and erosion. They share a geometric form because both are subject to the same mathematical constraints of optimal pathways and energy minima. The cartographer's thrill is not misplaced, it is simply misattributed. He has mistaken a formal analogy for a causal connection. This is the precise threshold that we must cross as we stand before the remarkable work of the mathematical physicists Giampiero Bardella and Simone Francini. In a recent series of papers, though these researchers performed a feat of extraordinary computational elegance. They took the established neural models of the entorhinal cortex, the continuous attractor networks that simulate the foraging rat, and applied a technique borrowed from the deepest vaults of quantum physics, lattice gauge theory, pioneered by the great Kenneth Wilson. Let us pause to honor Wilson's achievement. In the 1970s, quantum chromodynamics was threatening to collapse under its own mathematical weight. The infinities of the quantum vacuum were so explosive that the equations broke down entirely when physicists attempted to calculate the strong nuclear force. Wilson's stroke of genius was to, to make discrete the continuous, unbroken space time of the universe, placing it onto a rigid computational lattice. By doing so, like a grid, and by doing so, he tamed those infinities, bringing the wildest extremes of subatomic reality into the realm of calculable numbers. Now, Bardella and Francini adopted this exact, the discretization technique to the two-dimensional floor of a rat's enclosure, making it all discrete. They treated the environmental space as a grid, and they defined an action, functional, an equation that sums up the energetic cost of every possible neural firing configuration. Then, using Monte Carlo simulations, they allowed the system to relax into its absolute lowest energy state. And what emerged, as if by a mathematical miracle, was a hexagonal lattice. The very same honeycomb geometry that Wilson found in the vacuum of the strong force was now emerging from the firing patterns of mammalian neurons. But let us be meticulously precise about what this does, and just as importantly, what it does not do. What this work proves is that the hexagonal is the universal optima for encoding two-dimensional trajectories. Whether we are dealing with quark gluon plasma or a rat searching for chocolate crumbs, mathematics dictates that when a system must maximize spatial resolution while minimizing energetic expenditure, the hexagonal lattice is the uniquely parsimonious solution. These equations governing the stability of the quantum vacuum and the equations governing the stability of the neural grid share a formal mathematical architecture. They are both examples of a geometric optimization problem solved on a discrete lattice. However, and this is the crux of our philosophical excavation, this formal architecture does not imply a structural isomorphism or of the physical forces involved. Wilson's lattice gauge, theory governs non-abelian gauge symmetries, color charges, and the strong nuclear force. The neural equations, by contrast, govern firing rates, synaptic weights, and the dynamics of excitatory and inhibitory populations. The algebra is entirely different. The hexagon is a shared geometry, okay? It's a shared geometrical shape, but it emerges from wholly disparate causal mechanisms. To claim that they are structurally isomorphic, which means exactly the same, is to confuse a coincidence of mathematical form with an identity of physical substance. Furthermore, and this is a point of immense consequence, the Bardella-Franchini model is thoroughly classic. There is no quantum entanglement in the entorhinal cortex, no wave function collapse, and no superposition of neural states. The brainwaves do not act like light. The action they minimize is a classical statistical mechanical action, not the quantum path integral of like Richard Feynman. The Monte Carlo, this machine, the Monte Carlo simulations are a computational artifact, a technique for finding the ground state of a classical system. They are not a description of how the brain actually computes. The brain arrives at the hexagon through Hebbian plasticity and spike timing dependent plasticity, not through quantum fluctuations. To label this a quantum neural bridge is a rhetorical overreach that will invite the justifiable skepticism of both physicists and neuroscientists. A more faithful term would be the latest optimization bridge or the geometric action principle, titles that honor the mathematical elegance without slipping into metaphysical inflation. We must also address the current state of the scientific consensus. The dominant models in contemporary neuroscience remain the continuous attractor network and the oscillatory inference models. These frameworks have decades of experimental data and anatomical plausibility behind them. The latest gauge approach, as of this essay, this lecture I'm doing right now, this was a year and a half ago I wrote this, but as of right now, serves as a beautiful redescription of the attractor network's optimality. It demonstrates why the hexagon emerges, but it does not replace the mechanistic explanations of how the hexagon is generated by synaptic interactions. It is a theoretical unification, a mathematical proof of elegance, but it has not yet generated novel, falsifiable predictions that distinguish it from its rivals. It is a gift to the philosopher, but it is not as yet the final word in the laboratory. So why then does this matter for our philosophical inquiry? Why should we linger on the distinction between a formal analogy and a causal identity? Because here at this precise intersection, we encounter one of the most seductive errors in the history of ideas. It is the error of the German idealists of Fichte and Hegel, who, having inherited Kant's critical philosophy, could not tolerate the boundary of the unknowable. They attempted to collapse the transcendental into the empirical, to pull the infinite down into the finite, to make the human mind the absolute spirit of the universe. If we declare that the brain's hexagon proves the mind is the universe awake, we are committing the exact same error, just from the opposite direction. We are collapsing metaphysics into biology. The true philosophical lesson of Bardella and Franchini's work is not validation, but resonance. The fact that the same hexagon appears in the quantum vacuum and in the mammalian skull is a stunning confirmation of Galileo's ancient insight. The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. It is a testament to the universal constraint principles that govern all systems, from the subatomic to the neural, and it resonates deeply with Kant's claim that the mind is not a passive receiver, but an active structurer of experience. The brain's architecture is, in its phenomenal expression, calibrated to the same logical necessities that underlie the physical cosmos. And that is really what I'm trying to say here, is that it's just the observance of two things that appear to be the same, For us to find logic in both of these aspects, from the cosmos to the brain, we have the same patterns occurring, just like when we try to map out the rivers on the planet to when we try to find the pathways of the planets. We see these same river shapes. We see the same things occurring, though they are from completely different ways of occurring in themselves. I really have to be adamant here that this calibration is a phenomenal echo, not transcendental proof. Okay, so the empirical observation of a hexagonal lattice cannot justify the absolute a priori of spatial geometry. As Kant himself warned, the quid juris, the question of right or justification, cannot be answered by quid facti, or the question of empirical fact. We do not derive the necessity of space from looking at the brain. We can only recognize the brain's isomorphism to that necessity, because we already possess the transcendental framework that makes such recognition possible. Therefore, the bridge between quantum physics and neuroscience is a bridge of form, not of substance. It is a mathematical resonance that hums across scale, offering us a breathtaking glimpse of the elegant constraints under which both quarks and neurons are compelled to operate. But it is not a formal analogy, not a causal identity. It is a metaphor for the coherence of existence, not a proof of the soul. As we prepare to transition from the physics of the spatial lattice to the metaphysics of the moral law, let us carry this distinction with unyielding clarity. The hexagonal grid is not the ghost in the machine. It is not a cosmic secret written in our flesh. It is a phenomenal signature of a mind that is intimately and mysteriously tuned to the same mathematical truths that govern the stars. And that, in itself, is a truth profound enough to sustain our inquiry. For if the mind is so calibrated to the geometry of the cosmos, then perhaps the moral geometry we are about to explore, the architecture of duty, freedom, and the highest good, is not a human invention, but a natural law waiting to be recognized, built into the very fabric of our own being. We now have mapped the space of reality with all its necessary limits and its breathtaking harmonies. Let us now turn with the same exacting precision to the time of our existence and, beyond that, to the ethical imperatives that await us on the other side. And I was going to cut it off here because I'm already hitting at like the 54-minute mark here, but I'm going to actually finish off section 2, and then we'll make section 3 its own part. So we'll have 2A and 2B. Okay, so section 2 is time, idealism, and the pre-formatted canvas. So imagine we are seated at the center of a grand, acoustically perfect concert hall, perfectly blindfolded. Before us, a master pianist strikes a single chord, and he allows it to ring out and then follows it with a cascading arpeggio. How do we experience this as music? If our consciousness were truly trapped in the absolute present, a flickering instantaneous now that vanished the moment it arrived, the music would be impossible to hear. The first chord would cease to exist before the second note was struck. To perceive a melody, the mind must somehow hold the past in its grip while simultaneously reaching forward into the unplayed future, binding discrete acoustic impacts into a unified flowing sequence. This simple thought experiment strikes at the heart of our most profound cognitive mystery. If space is the static geometric honeycomb we explored previously, what gives us the music of existence? Kant, Immanuel Kant, in his relentless excavation of the human mind, identified this unifying flow as the pure form of inner sense, time. For Kant, time is not a physical container out there in the void, nor is it a property of objects themselves. It is the inescapable rhythm of our own mind's supply, the subjective condition under which alone all of our intuitions can be ordered. To understand how the brain organizes this temporal sequence is to step over the threshold of empirical biology into the study of the phenomenal correlates of metaphysical structures. We are observing the physiological substrate through which the form of inner space is manifested in experience. The symphony of the sweep, theta rhythm, is the form of inner sense. Kant argued that without the a priori form of time, we could not represent any succession or coexistence in the world. Change itself would be an incoherent concept. In the deepest architectures of the mammalian brain, spanning the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, we find the living, pulsing embodiment of this Kantian necessity, or so it seems. It takes the form of the theta rhythm, a continuous rolling electromagnetic oscillation vibrating between 6 and 10 times per second at between 6 to 10 hertz. This is not a mere background hum. It is the conductor's baton commanding the orchestra of the brain. As an organism moves through its environment, or even as it simply sits and contemplates a route, this theta rhythm sweeps through the neural circuitry. But it does something far more astonishing than simply keeping time. It engages in a phenomenon known as the theta phase precession. To understand phase precession, we must picture the grid cells and place cells firing as we move. As we enter a specific location, the neurons corresponding to that location begin to fire. But they do not fire randomly. They fire at a specific phase of the overarching theta wave. As we progress forward, these cells fire at progressively earlier phases of that theta cycle. What this means functionally is that within a single fraction of a second, within one single sweep of the theta wave, the brain fires a sequence of cells representing where we just were, where we currently are, and where we are about to be. The theta sweep comprehensively projects future trajectories. It takes the sprawling, sequential, physical reality of a 10-second walk and compresses it into a 100-millisecond neural sequence. This is the physiological generation of before and after. Time as we experience it is not extracted from the ticking of external clocks or the turning of the seasons. It is actively forged by this comprehensive, anticipatory neural sweep. The theta rhythm serves as the phenomenal infrastructure for the form of inner sense that Kant described, providing the physiological pacing that allows the mind to synthesize successions into a coherent melody. To conflate this pure a priori generation of time with mere empirical memory or biological process is a hallucination of categories. It is an error of attribution, as careless as claiming that the acclaimed narrator Simon Vance recorded Karl Marx's Capital simply because he happens to read a book about Marx. Precision is everything in this excavation. The physical brain is itself an appearance within space and time, and thus cannot be the origin of the transcendental conditions that allow it to be perceived. Empirical memory, the facts we learn about the world, is secondary. Even when we learn the facts about a highly detailed world, such as a fictional universe in a novel, that knowledge is entirely synthetic a posteriori. It is learned after the fact of exposure. But the sweeping temporal rhythm that allows us to sequence those facts, read the words, and hold a narrative together, that is synthetic a priori. It is the unlearned prerequisite for any narrative to exist at all, whose validity is independent of the empirical geometry of the cells that track it. The thing in itself and the biological edge of the map. Once we establish that space and time are our own neurological projections, the honeycomb and the sweep, we immediately crash into the most controversial and misunderstood boundary in the history of philosophy, Kant's Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Many readers mistakenly interpret the thing in itself as a mystical, ghostly realm hiding just behind a curtain, a more true reality that we are simply too dull to see. But let us look at it through the lens of the entorhinal hippocampal bandwidth. The grid cell network operates within strict Euclidean continuous two-dimensional parameters. It is an extraordinary instrument, but like any instrument, it possesses a specific bandwidth. The thing in itself is not a collection of unprocessed physical data or a hidden empirical residue. It is a purely intelligible boundary concept or noumenon that defines the limits of our sensibility. It represents reality as it might exist independently of our subjective formatting. But precisely because it is exempt from the forms of sensible intuition, space, and time, it remains fundamentally inaccessible to our theoretical knowledge. Kant established this boundary not to induce skepticism, but to secure the absolute certainty of our phenomenal experience within its own necessary limits. By defining the nominal or the noumenal as that which we cannot know, he protected the objective validity of the world as we must perceive it. Transcendental idealism and the warping of the world. This brings us to a vital distinction, one that protects us from the solipsistic dread that we are all merely trapped in a private hallucination. Kant called his philosophy transcendental idealism, but he fiercely paired it with the empirical realism. To understand how these two concepts interlock, we must look at the modern experiments involving virtual reality and optogenetics. When scientists place a navigating animal into a virtual reality environment, they can manipulate the visual laws of physics. They can take the virtual room the animal is exploring and suddenly stretch it, elongating the walls like melted caramel. If John Locke and the strict empiricists were right, if the mind were truly a passive receiver of external reality, the animal's brain would simply adapt, recording the new stretched dimensions of the room. But that is not what happens. The grid cells refuse to bend. The rigid a priori hexagonal lattice in the entorhinal cortex holds its shape. Because the internal compass refuses to yield to the contradictory sensory input, the animal's perception of the world warps to fit the internal lattice. The animal will misjudge distances, stopping short or running long, trying to force the external world to match its internal geometric mandate. However, we must be careful not to mistake these empirical distortions for a proof of the transcendental ground itself. While these experiments illustrate the rigidity of our internal mapping, an empirical illusion occurring within the framework of space cannot validate space as the subjective a priori condition of experience. Such biological persistence is merely a phenomenal correlate. The true proof of transcendental idealism lies in the absolute necessity and universality of geometric and temporal relations, which could never be derived from the contingent observations of the physical world. Yet this does not mean the world is a private illusion, because every healthy human brain is equipped with the exact same entorhinal architecture. We all project the identical spatial and temporal laws onto the universe. We can build bridges, launch satellites, and agree on the speed of light because our shared physiological hardware reflects a shared transcendental geometry. We share the world precisely because we all format it in the exact same way. Let's move on to the myth of the blank slate and the pre-formatted canvas. We must now confront one of the most stubborn and pervasive dogmas of the modern age, the myth of the blank slate. For centuries, the empiricist tradition has insisted that the newborn mind is a tabula rasa, a dark and empty room waiting for experience to slowly furnish it with ideas. The empiricist argues that we learn to fear danger, recognize our own kind, and understand causality solely through repeated exposure and habit. But as the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid warned us, habit alone can only ever yield expectation. It can never produce the ironclad must of necessity. If we rely solely on the accumulation of data, we are forever vulnerable to the problem of induction. The philosopher C.D. Broad went further, brilliantly exposing the self-refutation of radical empiricism. Broad observed that the empiricist who denies the existence of an a priori structures must use logic, sequence, and systematic reasoning to make their argument, relying on the very innate structural unities they are attempting to deny. Biology has decisively settled this debate, driving a full nail into the coffin of the blank slate. I mean, consider the developmental studies conducted on the neonatal rhesus macaques, these types of monkeys. Within hours of birth, having spent their brief existence entirely within the muffled, dark enclosure of the womb and a sterilized lab, these infants are exposed to various sounds. Researchers discovered that the neurons in the auditory cortex of these hours-old macaques are already innately tuned to respond to species-specific distress cries. Before the monkey has ever even seen a predator, before it has ever felt pain, before it has any empirical habit or exposure to draw upon, its brain is already listening for the specific frequency of its kin crying out for help. The neural architecture is not a blank slate. It is a highly specialized, fiercely pre-formatted canvas. This biological reality forces us to reconsider the very nature of existence. As we investigate how the mind shapes reality, we must remember the ancient Greek understanding of nature, not as a static noun, but as an active verb. We must recognize physis as the active verb of physis. Reality is an active bursting forth, an emergence. The pre-formatted brain does not wait passively for the world to write upon it. It actively reaches out, imposing its tuning, its grids, and its sweeps upon the incoming data. The Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zampfe viewed our hyper-evolved, highly formatted consciousness as a tragic biological error, a cruel excess of neurology that exiles humanity from the simple, unreflective harmony of the animal kingdom. Zampfe believed that our ability to project into the future and comprehend our own morality was an evolutionary misstep that doomed us to existential panic. But where Zampfe saw tragedy, Kant saw our ultimate dignity. Yes, the pre-formatted canvas separates us from the blind immediacy of nature. But it is precisely this formatting that elevates us into the realm of reason, logic, and ultimately freedom. The horizon of agency, from spatial sweeps to moral imperatives. Why does all of this physiological mapping matter to the philosopher, the theologian, or the everyday person trying to live a meaningful life? Why does it matter that our brains compress physical space into a forward-reaching theta sweep? It matters because the mechanics of physical navigation are the evolutionary precursors to moral agency. We have established that the theta sweep allows for an organism to comprehensively project future physical trajectories. The brain simulates the path ahead before the foot ever hits the ground. But as the human prefrontal cortex expands and integrates into this eternal hippocampal system, this physical simulation undergoes a miraculous transformation. It ceases to be merely about spatial geometry and becomes about ethical time. The ability to run a theta sweep of a physical maze provides a phenomenal metaphor for how the mind prepares the temporal field for action. As the human prefrontal cortex expands, integrates with this eternal hippocampal system, this physical simulation undergoes a miraculous transformation. It ceases to be merely about spatial geometry and becomes the theater for ethical time. When we pause before telling a lie or before hoarding a resource, our brain exhibits massive, globally synchronized activity. We are universalizing our maxims across time and feeling the weight of those projected realities before we ever act. The theta sweep is the physiological theater where the mind, the human mind, consciousness is expressed. As we peel back the layers of our own biology, looking at the absolute bedrock of how the organism interfaces with reality, we do not find Schopenhauer's blind chaos, nor do we find Nietzsche's warring parliament of drives. We find Euclidean rigor. We find the immaculate hexagonal symmetry of the grid cells. We find the highly orchestrated anticipatory rhythm of the theta wave. At the very foundation of our being, there is no chaotic will. There is a deeply structured, purposive order. We are not accidents adrift in a sea of meaningless drives. We are exquisitely formatted engines of coherence, built from the ground up to synthesize, to anticipate, and to unify. The Kantian architecture of the mind is not just a theory of epistemology. It is the physiological blueprint of a creature destined for moral responsibility. As we prepare to transition to part 3 and examine the apodeictic Imago Dei, we must carry this truth with us. The mind's ability to transcend the immediate present, to simulate the ethical future, and to bind the chaotic manifold of reality into a unified whole. This is not a biological accident. It is the necessary precondition for freedom. The brain's predictive sweep is what allows us to step out of the deterministic chain of mere animal reaction and into the unconditioned space of moral choice. The canvas is pre-formatted. The timeline is sweeping forward. And we are the authors of what comes next. And that will be in 2B. See you then.